ready?
Almostest.
The mostest or the ghostest?
Got a lot going on here, boy.
Mm-hmm. You're the tech master.
I know all that.
Uh-huh. Go on.
Oops.
I certainly am not.
Let's start the iPad in a second.
We're rolling?
Yeah. Move a little closer. Just be careful. What time is it?
58.
Got a second, then I'll start it. You can start it.
Hmm?
You want to start it? Or
Yeah, I can start. Okay, everything else is going?
Everything else is running.
That's the only thing I have to start. All right. Well, then I'll do that.
We got these in. I have to listen to make sure I don't get kind of weird feedback from like one thing or another.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. A fine Saturday morning. God is merciful again today. We're told that his mercies are new every morning, and that's a great thing because yesterday's mercies will not suffice for today. I trust that you had a great day yesterday and that you're ready to learn a little more about God and his creation. There are 7 fundamental facts that we think set the framework for understanding everything there is going on in the world. It doesn't deal with every possible detail, but it does set the framework. And I don't know about you, but I can't understand anything if I have to understand each detail first. Then I put them all together in one big picture. I have to have some notion of the big picture. Otherwise, I'm totally lost. I'm as dumb as a post. But if I get the big picture, I can start putting details where they belong, and everything makes some sense to me. If you don't function that way, well, then I guess I can't help you very much, but that's the way I function. First of all, the first of these 7 truths is that God created the cosmos for his glory, not for man's. Second, the jewel of creation is mankind. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God ordained Adam's fall. Fourth, in Adam, not only Adam and Eve fell, but the entire creation, including all of their progeny, their offspring to come, plus the physical creation also. Fifth, as a result of the fall, God pronounced a curse of perpetual enmity that can only be healed by God himself between the seed of the woman, that is Jesus Christ and all those in him, and the seed of the serpent, that is fallen Adam, the serpent, Satan, his demons, and the balance of humanity. This division, this enmity, is known as the great antithesis. Sixth, this great antithesis characterizes all of subsequent human social experience, that is to say, all of history until the judgment day. Seventh, the unregenerate, the seed of the serpent, those who remain hostile to God, are without excuse. God has planted knowledge of himself in their own hearts and in the world around them, and they deliberately choose to deceive themselves and deny, suppress that truth in unrighteousness. That's what Paul tells us in Romans 1. So those are the seven basic building blocks upon which we found our view of everything there is going on in the world. We've been talking about the Reformation, and at this point, we're talking about man's free will. Does man have a free will? Well, before we get to that, there's a point that I think is important to address, because I realized yesterday that I've been talking a great deal about God's anger, God's hatred for sin and sinners, and those are true. But I don't mean in doing so to minimize the fact that God is an incredibly loving God. Now, how do we square these two things? Well, we try to have a biblical view of both of them. First of all, to understand God's anger and God's hatred, you can't think in terms of human anger or human hatred. Why? Because when we're angry as human beings, we tend to be spiteful and malicious. And God's anger and his hatred have nothing to do with spite and malice. God is perfectly holy, and sin is the opposite of holiness. And so, since he's created all of his creation good and sinless, introducing sin into that creation is a terrible affront to his holiness. And he has to have a holy anger against that sinfulness. He has to have a holy hatred for that sinfulness. It doesn't mean that he's spiteful or malicious toward sinners, but he cannot fail to be just toward them. And his justice demands that they pay the price for their sin. We are, in fact, sinners in the hands of an angry God, as Jonathan Edwards said in the 1700s in his most famous sermon, which, by the way, resulted in the conversion of countless thousands of people in America at that time. So, besides that, listen, extending grace, that is, Jesus dying on the cross to save some people, is an act of incredible love on the part of God. Why? Because all of these people, when God looks at humanity, he's looking, before the earth was hung in space, what does he see when he looks forward to see all of humanity? He sees only an unrelieved landscape of rebels who hate him and who deliberately rebel against him, denying who he is and choosing their own wills in preference to his will for them. Now, they are creatures, fallible. They make mistakes. They will destroy themselves and each other. And nevertheless, he sent his son to save some of those people. He's not obligated to save any of those people. And no one could say that if he chose not to save anybody, that he would be unjust, or he would be less than holy, or less than good. He would be all those things. He is good, and he is holy, and he is just. And he is not obligated to save a single person. So if he sent his son to save some people, that's an act of great love, great sacrifice, great mercy, great grace. And to insist that that grace has to be extended beyond the people that he has chosen is just nonsense. So God is in fact the God of love. And if he has chosen you, a fallen, sinful, filthy creature who Paul says in Romans 3 at verse 12, that you are worthless, that you are one of those that does not seek after him, does not desire righteousness, and nevertheless he has saved you, then your only proper response must be gratitude, obedience, and love for him. How could you not be grateful, obedient, and loving toward him? I don't know. It makes no sense. Not because you become a good person, but because you realize what he has done. I mean, you deserve to be burning in the pit of hell. And instead, he has done this incredible work of mercy and grace for you. Why? And he won't let you go. He pulls you away from the edge of the cliff, which you keep wandering toward like a wayward child. He won't let you fall off. It looks like you will from time to time. Oh my. All the times that I've tried to jump off the cliff and he won't let me. Oh, I'm so grateful to him. And I know the only reason I haven't jumped off is because he won't let me. And because he won't let me, I know that I won't jump off. But I don't put my faith and trust in me. I put my faith and trust in his love for me. Not that I deserve it. I absolutely do not. And I don't feel superior to people who are lost because I know there's nothing in me that distinguishes me from them. It's in Christ, in God. He chose to magnify his glory and his mercy by choosing a terrible human being, me, to save. How can I crow about that? What did I do to earn that? Nothing. What do I do to continue to earn it? Nothing. Well, am I not doing all this to gain his favor? No. I'm doing this because I love him and I want to tell everybody how wonderful he is and how terrible sin is and how he's very unhappy with sin, how he hates it and he's wrathful toward it. And please stay away from the edge of the cliff. Well, do you think you're going to save people by inciting their fears? Well, I certainly hope to scare them enough to realize there's a cliff over there they're getting ready to fall off of. I mean, if you see somebody getting ready to fall off the edge of a cliff, don't you want to frighten them and say, hey, there's a cliff over there, and you're walking toward it and you've got blindfold on? I mean, don't you want to tell them that? Take off your blindfold. There's a cliff. Well, that might frighten them. Oh, well, my goodness, I certainly wouldn't want to frighten them. I'd rather they fall to the bottom of the cliff and I'll say, well, I didn't want to interfere with your free will. So let's talk about free will. Does man have free will? Well, it depends on how you define things, okay? Humanists would want to define free will as a will that's perfectly uncaused, okay? That at any time you can choose anything without any particular reason. Well, that's simply nonsense. Why? Well, because, first of all, if you're choosing, you'd be like Alice in Wonderland, who comes to the crossroads, and the big rabbit is there. She's mystified. She doesn't know which way to go. And he says, what seems to be the problem? And she says, well, I can't decide which way to go. Should I go right? Should I go left? And he says, well, where are you headed? And she says, I don't know. And he says, well, in that case, any road will do. And that's right. If you don't know where you're going, if your will is perfectly uncaused, it means it doesn't have a reason for any decision it makes. Well, that's nonsense. You have a reason for every decision you make. It may not be a good reason. It may be a reason that you're not even aware of, but there's a reason, okay? Something in you prompted you to decide whatever you decided all the time. And you always decided based upon the strongest reason that you had. How do I know that? Well, the Bible tells us that, but not only that, I look at myself and I look around me, and that's exactly what I see. I see it all day long. I see people choosing things they want to do. That's what they do. So, in what sense can our will be said to be free? And in what sense is it not free? Well, first of all, Jesus says that if you're a sinner, that means if you're in the seat of the serpent, you are a slave to sin. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't freely choose the things that you choose. It means, yes, of course, you still are making free choices. You're choosing your greatest desire. But when you're a slave to sin, your greatest desire is to sin, not to be submissive to God. So, yes, your will is free, and no, it's not free. It is enslaved to sin. Well, how can we call that free? Well, it's free from external compulsion or coercion. That's the thing you have to understand. Yet it's enslaved by the necessity forced upon it by your own evil desires, making you your own jailer, as well as a prisoner to sin, while leaving you culpable for your sins. Okay, Jesus calls the sinner a slave to sin. In the same way that no slave is free, no sinner is free. That is to say, no one in the flesh, which means a member of the seed of the serpent, is free from the compulsion within himself to follow his own will, which is opposite of following God's will, which makes it sin. Okay, following your will in preference to following God's will is the definition of sin. So if that's all you can do because it's all you will do, then clearly you're a slave to your own will, to your own sin. Well, is your will not then free? Well, in the sense that nobody's forcing you to do anything, it's perfectly free. In the sense that your will, your own desires are forcing you to choose them and not obedience to God, then you're not free. As I said yesterday, it makes as much sense to speak of a man's being free to choose to be an elephant as it does to speak of him being free to do anything other than his own will dictates. As discussed earlier, the philosophical distinction to make is to bear in mind this is between compulsion and necessity. Okay? We are compelled to do things by outside forces. We necessarily do things that come out of ourselves. If the desire to do something is so overpowering that we will do it, we tend to say that I was compelled to do this by my own desires. Well, that's a little misleading. We're compelled by something outside of us, but we're forced by the necessity of our own desires, of our own natures, to do those things that we most desire to do. Okay, so there's compulsion, that's an outside force, coercion, and we have necessity. That's something in ourselves. By necessity, you will always choose the choice that most pleases you at any time. Why? Well, because you can't do anything else. You can't choose your second best choice because in choosing, you have made it your first choice. If it was still your second choice, you would have chosen something else. Duh. A person will always necessarily choose his strongest desire. One who hates God will necessarily always choose actions consistent with his hatred for God. That's the way it works. It's the way you work. It's the way human beings work. It's the way I worked when I hated God, and I did hate God. And if you are not converted, regenerated, you hate God. And if you were at some point, you hated God before that. Oh, I didn't, people say. Yes, you did. God says so. While the distinction between compulsion and necessity may seem on casual analysis to lack meaning, hopefully further and deeper reflection will correct the mistaken impression. The distinction hinges upon the motive for the action. If the motive to act is to please oneself despite God's admonition to the contrary, one sins. If the motive is to please God, but the will is sufficiently coerced by some other person, such as to result in sinful action, then the moral onus of the action falls on the one coercing, not on the one performing the outward action. If someone points a gun at your head and says, I want you to commit this sin, and you don't want to die, then you'll commit the sin. Now, at that point, you desire more to stay alive than you desire to avoid committing the sin. That's correct. But God does not hold you accountable for that sin, because desiring to stay alive is something that you should do. And therefore, the one compelling you is the one responsible for your sin. If the motive to act is to please God and the action follows the motive and conforms to God's righteousness, it is a righteous act. If I want to be kind to somebody, and I am kind to somebody, and God commands that I be kind to somebody, then that kindness is a righteous act. If I want to be kind to somebody because I want to manipulate them to get some value for myself out of that, if it's a transaction, God never commanded that. It is not a righteous act. Well, it looks like a righteous act, yes, but the motive was bad. Okay? Well, should I never do transactions? Well, yes, you should do transactions, but you shouldn't couch your transactions as if they're acts of love. They're not. They're transactions. When I go to the store, I don't tell the grocer, listen, I love you so much. Could you please sell me this loaf of bread for half price? Or I don't tell him, listen, I'm going to pay the full price for this loaf of bread because of my love for you. I love you so much. No, I should love him. But whether I pay the full price or I don't pay the full price is entirely apart from whether I love him or not. That's a transaction. He says, this is what the loaf is worth to me. I will take this much money and I'll give you this loaf. Or I will hold on to this loaf and trade it for money with someone else. Or I'll let it get stale and throw it away. That's up to him. And what's up to me is I either pay the money or I don't. But to cloud the issue by talking about my love for him as somehow the basis for some aspect of the transaction is just to cloud the issue. Doesn't make things clear at all. Do you understand? So we don't want to be talking about transactions if we're talking about love. And if you're pretending to be acting in love, then leave transactions out of it. They have nothing to do with it. Okay? That's why I'm not too crazy about Christmas, because people expect gifts. Now, the gift that you expect, let me guess, it's not a gift. It's owed, at least in the mind of the expectant one, huh? Why is he expecting? Did you tell him I'm going to give you a gift and therefore he's expecting it? Okay. If you did, he has the right to expect it. If you didn't tell him that and he's expecting it anyway, then somehow he thinks there's a transaction going on. And when Christmas comes around, you owe him this thing, whatever it is. Okay. But that's a transaction. That's not a gift. And no, I don't want to confuse love and transactions. They're two separate things. My son-in-law lives with me. He rents a room here. Okay. I love my son-in-law. And sometimes he offers me food that he has. And sometimes I offer him stuff I have. But the rent he pays is a transaction. The offers of favors back and forth, those are love offerings. He helps me with this podcast. That's a love offering. Okay. That's not a transaction. He's offered to do that. And we're working together in this ministry. And I appreciate what he's doing. But he doesn't owe me this. He doesn't owe me this. This is a love transaction. Okay? This is not part of his rent. And I hope I make that perfectly plain to him. And I appreciate what he does. But he doesn't owe it. You understand the difference? And I know it sounds pedantic even to insist on that distinction, but if you don't insist on that distinction, think of the confusion that arises. human relationships are generally destroyed by unrealistic expectations. If I expect you to do A and you don't realize that, and you do B, or you do realize it and you do B anyway, either way, I'm going to be disappointed in my expectations. Now, if they were unrealistic, shame on me. But if they were realistic and you didn't live up to it, shame on you. But if we make it plain what the expectations are, then I have justifications to say, look, I expected you to do this and you didn't do this. I have a reasonable expectation of that because of whatever. All right. It keeps the confusion down and helps us to love one another. Now, whether somebody has coerced you sufficiently to exempt you from moral responsibility for the actions that you do in response to the coercion is something that you have to answer between yourself, your conscience, and God. The principle is that if someone's moral coercion is sufficient, you're not responsible. But if some small child says, look, I'm going to beat you up unless you do whatever, which would be a sin, and you say, oh, I'm afraid this child's going to beat me up. So you do the sin that he wants you to do. I don't think that's going to be very convincing because you really weren't afraid he was going to beat you up. That you're just looking for an excuse. Now, we can look for excuses and call them coercion, but I don't think God is fooled and we shouldn't be. So anyway, keep those things in mind. All right. So what do we know about man? Okay. Fallen man always chooses to follow after his own desires and never chooses to please God. He cannot. Redeemed man can choose to please God, or he can choose to follow his own desires apart from pleasing God. Okay? A man is what he is. And it is what he is as his essence, the fountain of his desires, his nature, works itself out in his actions that is subject to judgment. The fact that his fallen will is in voluntary bondage to sin makes neither God nor anyone else force him to choose rebellion over submission. He never feels more completely himself and free than when he is deliberately acting in rebellion and slavishly following his desires rather than submitting to God's or anyone else's authority. In Calvin's day, the unrighteous people in Geneva, you know what they were known as? The libertines. Liberty, libertine, libera, freedom. They believed in having a maximum of freedom. Well, but sin doesn't set us free. But the feeling of being free when you sin is all wrapped up in the desire for sin itself. If we are fallen, we never feel so free as when we are specifically and deliberately violating God's law. Okay? When we see a sign that says, do not walk on the grass. Okay? Well, we really feel free when we walk on the grass. I'm free to walk on the grass. If you're in rebellion against God, you're going to want to walk on the grass as soon as you see a sign that says don't walk on the grass or any other commandment. And you feel free when you're doing that. Now, you're not free. You are moving yourself into terrible bondage. So the fact that your fallen will is in voluntary bondage to sin doesn't mean anybody's making you choose that sin. It means that you're freely choosing it because you want to be free to choose it. It is not making you free, but you're deliberately acting in rebellion and slavishly following your own desires. That's what makes your sin culpable. You are culpable for it. You sin by the necessity of your own nature, not by compulsion. In doing so, no violence is done to the will of the sinner, thus leaving the sinner perfectly free of coercion, yet an utter slave to sin. All right. I hope I've answered questions regarding the free will. Man's will is free and it is enslaved until God frees it by his act of regeneration. If he does not regenerate you, you remain a slave to sin. Well, but no, that's two choices. I mean, either you're a member of the seed of the serpent, or you are redeemed and placed into the category of the seed of the woman. Those are the only two choices. If you are a seed of the serpent, you are a slave to sin. If you're a seed of the woman, you have been freed from the slavery to sin, and now you may serve God. You may also still choose to sin, but you will not choose sin consistently over as a pattern for your entire life. You will not. Why? Because that's not who you are anymore. If you say that you are a child of God and you love your sin more than you love obeying him, then you are lying to yourself. James says, if you say you have no sin, the truth is not in you. That's what he says. All right. Well, I'll go with what James has to say. All right. Now we'll talk about providence and predestination. What's the difference? Well, first of all, predestination has the word has two aspects to it. One is a prefix, and the other is the root. The prefix is pre, which means before, and the root is destiny. Okay? So before something is what it's talking about. Now, what is the destiny? Every human being has one of two destinies. What would that be? We're either going to spend eternity with God or we're going to spend eternity without God. Those are the two destinies. Every human being faces those two destinies. And so, properly speaking, predestination has to do with where you're going to spend eternity. And that decision is made by God before the earth was hung in space. Okay? That's what it means. And the word is in the Bible, predestination. So before the earth was hung in space, the pre part, your destiny, your eternal destiny was determined. Okay? That's what predestination means. Now, providence, on the other hand, has to do with the working out of the individual details in your life so that you left 10 minutes earlier or 10 minutes later and you avoided a terrible accident that happened on the road. Or you met somebody providentially who told you about something that had you not met them, you wouldn't have learned about that, and it changed your whole life. That's the individual details working themselves out. And the question is God in control of those? But that question comes under the heading of God's providence, but under the heading of God's predestination is his being in control of your ultimate destiny, where you're going to spend eternity. Okay. I see we've completed our half hour. So we're going to pick up at this point tomorrow. Well, not tomorrow. No, tomorrow's Sunday. So we'll do this on Monday. We'll talk about providence and predestination and what John Calvin and Martin Luther had to say about these, what the Reformation taught about those, and what you should think about that. Okay. Trust you'll have a good day today. God will bless you and keep you, hold you safe from any harm, including COVID-19, but not limited to that. There are many ways we can die, starvation being one, suicide being another, and we're getting increasing reports of suicide by people who have become desperate and hopeless because they cannot earn a living, cannot feed their families any longer. I think the ridiculousness of what the government is doing is just becoming more and more apparent. And these people are demonstrating their fallenness as they intend to force you to do their will because they're preserving your life. That's God's job. That's not their job. And under God, it's our job to preserve our own lives. It's no part of the government's job, no part. But when they try to act as God, they insist on exercising the same sovereignty over you that he does, but they're malicious. They're evil. He's not. They're fallen. Okay. They worship power. God uses power. He doesn't worship power. He doesn't worship anything. Okay. He glorifies himself because he is the ultimate in holiness and goodness. Anyway.
Did you say the tender mercies of the wicked are
Cruel. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right. One of the Proverbs says the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. I don't recall which one it is. I wish I did. But it's true. The tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. They think they're being merciful. I'm not disputing that. I'm disputing whether they are in fact being merciful at all. Good intentions pave the road to where? Hell. Yes. So I'm not interested in all their good intentions. I'm interested in what God says the proper authority of the government is, and how far they should be going, and where they should stop. And they're not stopping where they should stop. When they want power, I assure you they don't want it in a vacuum, and they don't want it over people in China or Africa. They want it over you and me. All right? Have a great day. God bless you.
I looked it up, Proverbs 12:10.
Well, you should have said it.
Well, I looked it up right out. I didn't want to steal the thunder.
I
See.
hope that went all